This is a 2015 Caprice. It's a PPV. We have some code modifications available, the security removal and starter checks, engine tab. We'll start here. You can change the size and your tach output to your gauge cluster, your idle settings based on coolant temperature, your startup idle, and in gear, a minimum, maximum set point. We have adaptive idle for overspeed and underspeed. You can change your airflow by proportional. The follower when you let off the throttle. Integral. Each one of these can be broke down. I'll show you that too. Underspeed. Airflow. Coast down. Neutral and drive. Your idle. Drive. The steps that it takes. We have our airflow for idle. Airflow for air conditioning compressor kicking on and kicking off. Make the adjustment. When your cooling fan kicks off and on, when you shift gears, these are going to be to modify the difference when you have extra load added to the engine for most of these things. Your startup airflow, how much air it's going to need to start up. Is it based on time versus coolant temperature? How long before your mass airflow goes into a steady state? The follower on your throttle when you let off. We don't have four-wheel drive in this car, but it's still in programming. Go into the airflow tab. In general, you have your resistance for your intake air temp sensor. adjustments, maximum and minimum. Mass airflow calibration versus hertz, what it reads. Main VE table. As a side note, you can modify them in this table. You're going to do the copy and paste method. They're all for different situations with DOD, displacement on demand, cylinder shutdown, altitude things. This is for startup while the engine is cranking. More predicted. The gain from your map sensor. This is from your throttle position sensor gain versus airflow. These are basically the same as what you saw in the other VE for airflow. Your volumetric efficiency, again, can be adjusted up in edit. Electronic throttle. VSS would be your wheel speed sensor or transmission speed sensor. Vehicle speed sensor is what the VSS is. RPM is revolutions per minute for your engine tach based. This is the desired throttle area versus pedal position. I don't recommend changing these tables for this car. This is one of the reasons why a lot of people are getting the StabiliTrak and throttle errors on this car. Reduced power mode, this one will adjust for your pedal to operate the throttle body, but your fuel and spark will not. Reduced power mode will still continue to kick in and will be kicking in if you adjust these tables. I'm saying that for this specific car. We've run into trouble trying to adjust it out. In this case, the car would have come with one in this value. and it would have been set up for the displacement on demand, or VVT, I'm sorry. But the settings are still there. If you are not running a VVT cam, you can select none. If you were to fit a supercharger and run that 2-bar map sensor, you'd be able to add tables here for your supercharger settings. We're moving on to fuel. Most of these are fairly self-explanatory. This is your air-fuel ratio, stowage. You can reselect where your injector bank is. This flow rate is your injector flow rate versus pressure versus volts, intake air temperature, map sensor, flow. Your pulse width for the injectors from minimum. Your startup cranking fuel versus time, how long it's cranking. Here is your oxygen sensors. Your airflow modes. Long-term versus closed loop. Sorry. The long-term fuel trim boundaries. For purging. Delay. your adjustments for when it will go into open loop. This will be our power enrichment table. When it will enable, to delay it, the actual power enrichment itself. Catalyst protection to enrich your fuel to cool the catalytic converter to keep from burning it out. Your RPM limits. How it will control max RPM. When you let off the pedal, the cutoff. When it's allowed to enable and disable. Cylinder air mass enables and disables. By spark. And your fuel cutoff. Delay. And if you're in a manual vehicle, your clutch will cut off. This is for the DOD system, displacement on demand, to enable it or disable it, and when it's activated or cannot be activated, what gears it's allowed to operate in, your fuel transients, gains based on your fuel, if you're running a flex fuel vehicle or adding flex fuel, going into spark tables. A few different gains. Here's the one actually we'll be using the most. Low octane fuel and high octane fuel. This is high octane fuel for displacement on demand. Your spark table. Your flex fuel will also, since it's the flex fuel, it will have an additional adder versus what fuel you're running for spark. We have intake air temperature based spark smoothing. It will add or take away spark according to the intake air temperature outside. This is your computer controlled based on coolant temperature. Make adjustments based on your coolant temperature, taking away spark or adding spark. This vehicle didn't have an EGR. This is when you're heating up the catalytic converters. You can add spark to run hotter. How much spark is allowed for a cold launch, so the engine warms up. It will add or take away for maximum torque. And some additionals. Fuel. If you had an EGR. This is your idle spark table, where your advance and your coast down when you've let off the throttle. Idle spark according to additional spark adder, depending on the situation. When your idle gets too high a speed, it will take full timing. For when your idle speed is too low, it will add timing to compensate and keep the correct idle speed. This will be your spark for cranking. Your idle flare when it does fire. The minimum allowed spark advance. Your reduced power mode spark advance. Your torque management spark advance. Minimums. You got plenty of adjustments for what to do when it detects knock. Usually pulling timing. How fast to recover from it. How much it will learn from your fuel octane. These are for your DOD, your 4-cylinder mode. anything for your intake and air temperature. The maximum allowed the computer can pull timing. For which cylinder. Dwell times. The multiplier for it. Here is for knock sensors. Voltage and minimums. Multiplier based on cylinder. This is your general torque model. Throttle position sensor versus RPM. Barometric pressure. You have a VVT cam, the angle map. These would also be the coefficients. Air mass. All pretty well the same charts. Different selections. Depending on what map you're in. For E85 has a separate chart. Displacement on demand has its own air mass and spark. Map based and displacement on demand. This is torque loss versus AC pressure, knowing that your air conditioning compressor will produce a load. Lets our computer know that torque loss. This is the torque management settings. The maximum engine torque allowed, the maximum torque allowed to transmission per gear, how it will control it. These are all just enable or disable. This is your maximum allowed torque with the brake engaged. Throttle position versus torque. It will allow limit. When you let off the throttle quickly, how you want it to reduce torque. For your traction control systems, how they will be controlled, when they can be enabled or disabled. For wheel hop, and if you lose oil pressure. Again, for your air conditioning, torque reduction, and supercharger management. These are all enabled, disabled. That's it for the engine tab. We have the engine diagnostics tab. These are your C and P codes. For example, if you had this scenario, if you had a supercharger and an inlet pressure sensor, this is be able to turn on the service engine soon light. This is how the errors are reported. No error would be off, where it wouldn't report an error. It'll turn your light on the first error, on the second error, or no light, but still report the error. So it will show up in the scanner, but the light won't come on the dash. In this case, this doesn't exist in this car, so you would leave it off. This is the list of P codes and C codes that HP tuners can modify for this particular vehicle. We have in general the oil pressure sensor or switch. calculated minimum oil pressure, healthy temperature is calculated. Airflow errors, your misfire errors, especially important if you have a large cam. How many revolutions for an error is reported. Your upstream and downstream oxygen sensors, their lean versus rich thresholds, and currently in millivolts, but you can change this to volts depending on what you would recognize in there. Here is transmission settings. This car is an automatic. If you were a manual, you will select that, and these settings wouldn't matter. Your outspeed foot speed sensor that has one on the transmission, and the tests for that sensor. Your commanded gear control limits by RPM or speed. If you had a manual transmission, whether or not you had a clutch interlock on the vehicle. These aren't relevant if you have an automatic. If you're allowed to skip shifts. This is back to automatic transmission settings. These are the pattern types. In this car, your pattern A would be your regular driving mode. Pattern B would be if you pressed your sport mode or your trailer mode, which this car doesn't have a trailer mode. It does have the sport button, so you can tell what to do when it's in that pattern after you press that button, which shift pattern you want to use. Your tap up, tap down switch, if you have it on your steering wheel or if you add it in, you can enable it or disable it, and how it's wired. Your active ranges. The inertia. Allows you to calibrate the driver demand torque, more for shift feel. Your actual shift scheduling. These are different maps. I showed you the pattern A and pattern B, what they do. Pattern A is going to be your normal driving if you had just put it into drive. part throttle shifts as well. This would be your sport mode button in this car. For hot transmission, your tap up, tap downs, and safety. This is your full throttle, the speed you'll be moving when you want shifts. For up or down shifts, and what RPM. It's going to be RPM based shifting, what RPM you should be at. In this car, normal and pattern A, I believe, are the same. Pattern B will be your sport mode. This car does not have four-wheel drive, but they are in the system still. If you wanted to use the tap down, tap up switch, it will auto shift at a certain point on its own. And when your engine is hot mode, you have the same, you have full throttle for RPM in this scenario. Your shift pressures, depending on what shift pattern the car is using, those can be selected, which pattern you intend to use. Normal and pattern A, I believe, are the same in this car. Pattern B is in the sport mode button and your tap up, tap down shifts. For your manual engines or transmissions, you'll be able to allow for purge. General pressures and your maximum line pressure. This is the gear you're in. This is for your casual shifts. Now moving into your upshift patterns and the patterns. The torque versus transmission temperature. Gear 1 to 2 shift, 2 to 3 shift, 3 to 4, and then going back down, you've got 1 to 3, 1, depending on which, if you're going from 1 to 4, it's got different patterns, torque relevant to the shift that it's doing. You have downshifts, the shift pressure, your adaptive shift. This is what your transmission has learned. It'll allow it to adapt. These are all enable, disable. Volume, your volume preset. Shift timing. This is your torque adder. That's been applied versus RPM versus torque. special case. Your transition time between shifts, how fast it will make the shift between gears. Your final transition speed, how fast it will shift gears. The desired output torque. After the shift has completed. And your downshift speed between shifts. Here are your torque converter general, desired pressure, versus line pressure, the rate it will ramp in, and the maximum pressure, the desired slip when your air conditioner is on, the minimum slip with the air conditioner on. If you were using DOD, the allowed slip for the DOD when active, your high-speed lock, where it will full lock, and your torque converter adaptives. Here are some preload options, breakpoints. Your apply and release for the torque converter. For different shift patterns. Your full throttle. The applying the torque converter at full throttle. At what speed. These are all the same. Your torque management for the transmission. Stall torque management. Your torque limit, the maximum torque for the torque converter. Or tip in. Shift gear when you're shifting gears. Sorry, this is with no tip in torque management, no throttle or throttle only. For flare, the same, and your limit can be enabled temp and how it's limited, and your torque reduction for upshifts, downshifts, power shifts. And here's your maximum shift torque, your upshifts, the torque factor profile, cold multiplier also. You want to add the adder to it. Here is transmission diagnostics. The torque converter stuck off or on. These P codes. And your tap up, tap down switch. This has been added to the car. Or if it was already factory, it would be enabled. For it to trigger the computer to recognize if invalid torque signal was. And here's your DTCs, the C and P codes for the transmission settings. We're done with transmission diagnostics. This will be your fuel system, the type of pump, if you have a fixed or variable pump, and if the fuel pressure control module is fitted. From the factory does have one. These are your desired fuel pressures. When it's hot, you'll have an adder for cranking, desired fuel pressure, different conditions. Fuel pressure transitions. This is your fuel pump prime when you initially turn the key on. The duty cycle it can operate at, and the base pounds per hour. Some different gains for the feedback to the pump. Your fuel pump control module, maximum engine boost. We were operating supercharger, turbo, or nitrous. Your flow rate for your injectors. This needs to match what your engine table said. These can be copied and pasted in. They are a separate computer from the ECM under the hood, so it does need to know what your computer knows on the engine. So it will know the desired pressure. For open loop, multiplier versus voltage, your fuel rail pressure. You can adjust your fuel tank gauge for your gauge cluster. This is the capacity in the fuel tank. These are also the calculations for your miles to empty and your fuel mileage. In this case, it has two senders, the floats in the gas tank, one on each side of the vehicle. They're mechanical. If you had a single float, say for a pickup truck, you would have a single. Recognizing the fuel volume. These are your adjustments to adjust the gauge if it's not reading properly, or if you've changed your float, or for whatever reason. These tables can be modified. Your flex fuel sensor, whether or not it will run diagnostics on that sensor if it is on the vehicle. This also has its own DTCs reports for your C and P codes for the fuel pump control module. Here is your Systems tab. If the alternator has a voltage control, this does. It can be controlled by the computer or by the alternator. The ECM can adjust that. The requests, you can delay the alternator on startup or when it stalls. The minimum voltage fuel system, and your diagnostic systems. If this car had active exhaust, like the Camaros and some of the Corvettes have, it would be enabled or disabled here. Air fuel management, if it had that. Your exhaust valve, what it's doing by default, and the mode. These are your adjustments for the exhaust valve, or whether or not you want to allow for the exhaust rumble and what mode. These are different performance modes to open and close that valve. Your starter relay, starter diagnostics. This is your fan controls, depending on how they will be, what type they are. In this case, this is electric. How many fans are fitted, the frequency that those fans operate at on duty cycle. The relay control, how much is desired. Your output control versus current state. The startup delay for your fans, so they won't operate while you're cranking to rob power. Your control by percentage from engine coolant temperature, how much your percentage you're demanding. When the AC is on, how much fan percentage is desired, and the override limit. Your ignition off, how long it can run once your ignition is off. The runtime zones, and your engine control module control zone. Enables and disables by engine control and percentages. For off, this is for when the ignition is off. It can be enabled once the engine is off, while the engine is off, after you've shut the engine off and it is still hot, to continue to cool the engine down. This is if you have coolant pumps, one for your intercooler in that conditions. This is your air compressor for your air conditioning. You can disable at a certain RPM and re-enable. You can disable it based on how much throttle you're given the car to allow for the turn off of the air compressor to let you have more power, and when to re-enable it. These are your speedo calibrations, how the output is recognized by wheel speed or the vehicle serial, your transmission speed sensor versus, or your wheel speed sensors, which hardware you're going to use, what the drivetrain type is, CAN bus, which way it's going to be dealt with, the vehicle speed sensor pulses, your speed sensor configuration, if you have it on just the driven wheels or all four wheels, or the vehicle speed output being serial or disabled. your wheel speed output, your gear ratio and tire sizes. This is the calculating circumference. You can also change that to inches, foot, miles, and so forth. Your final drive ratios for your rear diff, transmission, and the calibration for your sensors, the distance of pulses or vehicle speed revolutions per distance or air or trans, your speed limiter, at what speed you want to limit the vehicle. If you wanted to set it to where the vehicle would not be able to go over 70 miles per hour. You can modify those. The conditions and RPM at which it's allowed to enable this, and the source that it's coming from. That is all of your editor tables for the 2015 Caprice.